And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing this strong low slowly weakening here just north of the western Aleutians there in the front, right through this area, keeping it wet and windy here across the eastern Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula. Diminishing snow, but persisting through the night here, especially around Nunivak Island, and areas of snow here over southern Alaska, right on over to the at least central Copper River Basin, Prince William Sound, Kenai Peninsula area, and probably mixed with rain along the coastline itself. Otherwise dry for the southeast coast, dry to the north. And then looking at tomorrow, this front really not moving much, as you can see, slowly northward and eastward, with this low taking off to the east a little bit, staying south of the Alaska Peninsula, but close enough to keep periods of rain going for the peninsula, and that now spreading up and on the increase some light rain for Kodiak Island, and this east-southeast flow starting to increase some moisture once again along the south coast of the Kenai Peninsula, otherwise drier over south-central Alaska. Copper River Basin, much drier day tomorrow, extending northward to the Arctic coast. Areas of light snow out here from Kotzebue Sound, Selawik area across the Seward Peninsula on down toward, St. Lawrence Island, meeting up with this front here that's now well north of the Aleutians, but close enough to the Pribilos or some light rain or snow there. Otherwise wet and unsettled with low pressure over the central and western Aleutian areas, and it stays dry for the southeast coast. And then for the day on Tuesday, this front really pushing northward a little bit more, elongated all the way down here to just south of Kodiak Island, and that other low pulling eastward here. And that will tend to tighten the gradient up over the Panhandle, so look for increasing northeast winds there, and east-northeast on the south coast. Dry over much of interior Alaska. Chance of some light moisture there in the south coast of the Kenai Peninsula. Periods of light rain, Kodiak Island, and light precipitation here along the southwest coast. And still periods of rain here over the Aleutians with that slowly weakening low pressure area. Coastal water forecasts there along the south coast, central and south coast. East winds 20 knots from the north coast, about the same. East winds 10 to 20 knots. Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, Stevens Passage, north winds at 15 knots, winds east at 15 there for Clarence Strait. And then big increase in the winds here on Tuesday with that tightening pressure gradient. Good gales, Lynn Canal, north 40 knots, seas 8 feet, north at 30 knots for Stevens Passage. And gales also in store for the Clarence Strait area at 35 knots. Here on the south coast, Prince of Wales Island, southeast 35 knots, central coast, east winds 30 to 35 knots, and for the north coast, east winds 20 to 30 knots. Prince William Sound tomorrow, winds east at 15, north Gulf Coast, east winds 20 to 25 knots, east winds at 30 knots for Kodiak Island, and Cook Inlet, north to northeast winds 20 to 30 knots. Gale warnings here for Kamishak Bay, with east winds at 30 knots, seas at 10 feet. Then here for the Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay, even stronger gale force winds, east at 45 knots. Gales now for southern Cook Inlet, northeast at 35 knots. Northern Cook Inlet, northeast at 25. Prince William Sound, northeast winds 20 knots. And the eastern North Gulf Coast, winds east at 30 knots, but northeast at 40 knots here on the west side. Kodiak Island tomorrow, gale warnings. East winds 35 to 40 knots in the Alaska Peninsula, east to southeasterlies at 30 to 35 knots. East winds 30 knots for Bristol Bay. No change for Bristol Bay on Tuesday there with east winds at 30. Southeast 20 to 30 knot winds for the Alaska Peninsula. Gales continue, Kodiak Island for east winds of 40 knots. Eastern Aleutians, south to southeast winds at 20 to 25 knots, south to southwest winds at 30 to 35 knots for Adak and Atka. And for the western Aleutians, you can see still looking at some gale force winds there, swirling around that low center near Kiska Island, anywhere from 25 to 40 knots or 45 knots. And then for the next day, we've got lighter winds for the western Aleutians at 20 to 25 knots, south to southeast, 20 knots for Adak and Atka, so starting to diminish there. And still looking at gale force winds for Unalaska Island from the southeast at 35 knots. And for the southwest coast, tomorrow, east winds 30 knots. Same thing for the Pribilofs and St. Matthew Island, as well as Norton Sound up here. And for St. Lawrence Islands, winds also east at 25 knots. Then for Tuesday, east winds 30 knots, Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island. Gale warnings for the southwest coast, east at 35 knots. East 35-knot winds continue for St. Matthew Island, and east at 30 knots with 10-foot seas for the Pribilofs. And for the Arctic coast, east winds 25 to 30 knots tomorrow. Northeast winds or east-northeast 20 to 30 knots for the Chukchi Sea. And the outlook for Tuesday, Arctic coast up here, east winds 25 to 30 knots. And for the Chukchi Sea, east-northeast winds at 15 to 30 knots.